But before I could act, things escalated even further. Around 9 p.m., I was in the barn finishing some equipment checks when I heard tires on gravel. Not one vehicle, several. I stepped outside and saw 3 HOA board members getting out of their cars, flashlights in hand. And behind them, Karen. Standing proudly like a queen surveying her territory, I walked toward them and demanded to know why they were on my property. One of the board members said they were here to perform a mandatory inspection. I told them they had no legal right to be on my land without permission or a court order. Karen folded her arms and said, "The HOA has authority over all properties in this neighborhood. Read your agreement." Her tone was arrogant, dismissive. I told her she was trespassing. She smirked. "You can try to stop us, but that will only make things worse for you." That was it. I pulled out my phone and started recording. I stated the date, time, and that the HOA board, led by Karen, was trespassing without consent. Suddenly, the board members hesitated. Karen glared at me and told them to continue. But they exchanged nervous looks. They weren't as bold as she was. "This is illegal," I said loudly enough that they all heard. "Keep going, and I will have every one of you charged." One of the board members backed away. Then another. Karen whipped around to face them. "Where are you going? We're doing our job." The oldest board member stepped back and said, "This isn't right, Karen. We shouldn't be here." Karen's face twisted with anger. "You're all cowards." I stared at her. "No, Karen. They're just tired of being controlled." For a moment, she looked genuinely stunned, like no one had ever said that to her before. She tried to gather herself. "You think you can record and threaten us and get away with it?" I kept the camera steady. "I don't need to threaten you. The evidence speaks for itself." Her eyes narrowed, sharp and venomous. "You have no idea who you're messing with." I stepped forward, my voice calm. "Neither do you." With the camera still rolling, I told them to leave or I would call the sheriff. This time, even Karen hesitated. She glared at me one last time before turning and storming back to her car. The others followed silently. I stood there in the dark, the adrenaline slowly fading, my hand still gripping the phone. She had crossed nearly every line possible, but now she had made a mistake. She showed weakness. Her control over the board was slipping. Her tactics were becoming desperate, and that meant she was vulnerable. I locked up the barn and went inside. It was time to move first. Time to stop reacting and start taking action. Karen had declared war. Now I was ready to fight it on my terms. The morning after the trespass, I woke with a plan instead of panic. The lawyer, Harris, had been firm. Move quickly, document everything, and remove Karen's ability to act through intimidation. He helped me draft the injunction and a formal complaint alleging harassment and abuse of authority by the HOA board, with Karen named as the primary instigator. The papers were filed that afternoon, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a small measure of relief, something procedural standing between me and the chaos she'd created. Word spread faster than I expected. David stopped by with a thermos of coffee and a cautious grin. "You actually did it," he said. "Good." She needed a check. Mark came too, bringing notes he'd taken at neighborhood meetings. People were tired, and many resented how the HOA had become Karen's personal project. Harris told me to keep a tight record of every interaction and to share copies of everything with him. I did. Receipts, letters, recordings, photographs, every piece reinforced the pattern of harassment. Not everyone wanted to be involved. A few neighbors sent sympathetic messages but stayed silent at meetings. Fear was powerful, and Karen had learned to harness it. Still, even those who stayed on the sidelines watched more carefully now, and more than one person admitted privately that Karen had gone too far. 2 days after the injunction was filed, Sheriff Collins stopped by. He was older, prospector tanned and practical, the sort of man who'd seen small-town disputes spiral into larger tragedies. Harris had requested a sheriff's check-in, and Collins arrived with his deputy to make sure tempers cooled. "We're here to keep things civil," he said plainly, as if the simple phrase could patch the raw edges Karen had exposed. I appreciated his no-nonsense approach. He reviewed the filings Harris had provided and spoke quietly about legal boundaries. "You did the right thing," he told me. "If she crosses the line, document it. Call us." Colin's visit seemed to rattle Karen more than any of the legal paperwork. She maintained a public posture of innocence, charitable, protective of the neighborhood, but in private she was clearly furious. I learned the next day that she had approached several neighbors aggressively, trying to convince them to withdraw their signatures from a petition opposing her. When that failed, she sped off to talk to a close friend on the county commission, attempting to pressure local officials. Her moves were petty and bold in equal measure. Then the retaliation escalated in a way that felt personal. One morning I stepped outside to find a burned patch at the edge of the field where the cut wire had been discovered weeks earlier. The dry grass had been singed in a deliberate semicircle, and someone had scattered broken glass near the gate. It looked like an attempt at vandalism or an ugly warning. I called Sheriff Collins immediately. He examined the scene, took photos, and agreed it could have been staged to make it look like my property was unsafe or neglected. "This kind of stunt can be intimidating," he said. "If you have any suspects, tell us." I had my suspicions, but accusing someone without proof could backfire. Harris counseled patience. Preserve the scene, collect more evidence, and avoid reacting publicly. So I did. I photographed the damage, logged it, and kept the burned patch as evidence. Meanwhile, the HOA board was under scrutiny. Harris had requested records of board communications, meeting minutes, and emails. Some board members complied reluctantly, others stonewalled. Karen, predictably, was evasive. When she realized legal eyes were on her, she sharpened her rhetoric, claiming I was disrupting community harmony, and that the injunction was a frivolous attempt to silence legitimate concerns. Her public statements aimed to paint me as the antagonist, but privately her allies were quieting, unsure whether continued loyalty was worth the legal exposure. One evening, Harris called with news. The judge had issued a temporary restraining order against Karen, barring her from contacting me or entering my property until a hearing could be scheduled. It felt like a small victory, a legal recognition that her actions had crossed a line. Karen responded with outrage, but the order stood. Harris reminded me that temporary victories were not final. The real fight would come at the hearing, where testimony, emails, and the record would matter. The town became divided. Some neighbors rallied to my side, citing long-ignored grievances and offering witness statements. Others, still loyal to Karen, or unwilling to be drawn into conflict, kept their distance. At the grocery store, conversations grew hushed when my name was mentioned. Karen was no longer merely a tyrant operating behind closed doors. She was a public figure under legal constraint, and people had to choose which side of the story they'd take. Despite the heat of the public squabble, the field still needed work. Harvest didn't wait for lawsuits. I hired extra help and kept the machines running with as much normalcy as possible. When Karen drove by one afternoon and parked near the entrance, she was stopped by a deputy enforcing the restraining order. Her face flashed with anger and humiliation as she sat in her SUV while the deputy delivered a warning. The sight felt anticlimactic and righteous at once. As the hearing date approached, Harris and I prepared. He coached me on testimony, on staying factual and avoiding emotional peaks that could be used against me. David and Mark rehearsed their statements, going over dates and details until everything was tight. We were ready to show a pattern: trespass, harassment, false complaints, and staged incidents. But even with evidence stacked against her, Karen remained unpredictable. She'd shown she could wield influence and, more troubling, vindictive creativity. The coming days would reveal whether the legal system could blunt a person who had turned an association into a weapon. I tried to sleep that night with the field's distant breathing outside the window and a sense of guarded hope in my chest. Karen had pushed me into the courtroom, and I planned to meet her there with every shred of truth I'd gathered. The morning started like any other during harvest season, with the sky just beginning to lighten and the air still cool enough to feel crisp against my skin. I stood at the edge of the cornfield, staring out across the rows that stretched toward the horizon. This land had been in my family longer than I'd been alive, and I knew every hill, every dip, every stubborn patch of soil that needed extra care. Out here, the world made sense. Hard work paid off. Effort mattered. Respect was earned. But lately, even out here on my own property, peace was getting harder to find. Because of the homeowners association, and more specifically, because of one relentless woman named Karen. Karen had only been HOA president for a year, but in that short time she'd made it clear she believed she had authority over everything and everyone within the association's reach. The problem was the HOA boundaries had recently expanded to include several rural properties, including mine. I never signed any agreement. I never asked to be part of their rules or restrictions, but Karen acted like my land was hers to control. She didn't understand farming. She didn't understand long hours, heavy machinery, or the simple fact that crops couldn't wait for her approval. She believed everything should look like a suburban postcard. Neatly trimmed lawns, clean driveways, identical houses lined up like soldiers. My fields and tractors were, in her words, a visual disturbance. I climbed into the tractor, the familiar smell of diesel and metal wrapping around me like an old jacket. As the engine roared to life, the ground trembled beneath the weight of the machine. I eased forward, cutting into the first row of dry stalks. The combine growled, shredding the corn as the sun peeked over the horizon. The rhythm was soothing: forward, cut, turn, unload, repeat. Out here, the problems with the HOA felt distant, like background noise I could tune out. But deep down, I knew Karen wasn't the type to let things go. She was patient in a terrifying way, like a trap just waiting to spring shut. Around mid-morning, I saw a small car parked near the end of the driveway. I squinted through the dust and sunlight. Even from a distance, I recognized the shape of it. Karen's silver SUV. A flare of irritation burned in my chest. She was back. Again. The last time she showed up, she tried to tell me I needed to move my tractor because it blocked the view of the road. The time before that, she demanded I pick up hay bales stacked by the barn because they looked messy. I kept hoping she'd eventually get bored and leave me alone. But she was getting bolder with each visit. I continued harvesting, hoping she'd stay by her vehicle and eventually give up. But Karen didn't know how to leave things alone. A few minutes later, I spotted her walking straight into the field, high heels sinking into the soft dirt, arms crossed like she owned the place. She didn't even hesitate. She marched right up to the edge of the tractor's path and waved her hand in the air, expecting me to stop everything just because she was there. I groaned under my breath and slowed the machine. I wasn't about to keep moving and risk hitting her. As much as she infuriated me, I wasn't stupid. I cut the engine, and the sudden silence felt unnatural after hours of constant noise. I opened the door and climbed down, boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. "What are you doing out here, Karen?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She lifted her chin. "You are in violation of HOA noise regulations." I stared at her. "Noise regulations?" "Yes," she said sharply. "Quiet hours begin at 8 in the morning on weekends." I blinked. "Karen, it's harvest season. I've been harvesting at this time every year for as long as I've lived here." She didn't care. Her expression remained cold and arrogant. "The rules apply to everyone. You are not exempt just because you operate farm equipment." Her tone made it sound like farming was a dirty word. "This is agricultural land," I said calmly. "Your HOA rules don't apply to my work," she smirked. "You'll find the board disagrees. This land has been used for farming for generations. You don't get to change that because it doesn't fit your idea of visual harmony." She took a step forward, pointing a manicured finger at the tractor. "This machinery is not appropriate for a residential community." "It's not a residential community," I snapped. "It's a farm." She didn't flinch. "Not anymore." Those 3 words hit deeper than I expected. Not anymore. Like she had already decided my land, my history, my livelihood no longer mattered. "You need to move this equipment," she continued, "and you need to stop harvesting until we approve a schedule." I let out a humorless laugh. "You're out of your mind if you think I'm asking permission to work my own land." Something cold flickered in her eyes. "You will regret this." She turned and walked away, heels digging into the soil. The sun caught her hair as she climbed into her SUV, slamming the door like she'd just won a battle. I watched her drive off, dust curling up behind her. As I stood in the silence of the field, I felt a shift. Today wasn't just another one of Karen's petty visits. This was different. She wasn't threatening fines anymore. She was threatening war, and I knew Karen well enough to understand one thing. She always followed through. The rest of the morning felt heavier, even with the sun climbing and the machines roaring. I tried to push Karen out of my mind, focusing on the steady rhythm of harvest. But her words echoed in my head like a warning. Not anymore. You will regret this. Karen didn't bluff. She schemed. She waited. She struck when people least expected it. And the worst part? She always believed she was right. By noon, I finished clearing one section of the field and parked the tractor near the barn to refuel. As I stepped down, I noticed a black sedan parked near the road. It wasn't Karen's SUV this time. Two men in suits stood near the vehicle, one holding a clipboard. They looked out of place, too clean, too polished. My stomach tightened. I walked toward them. Can I help you? I asked, wiping sweat from my forehead. One of them stepped forward. We're with the HOA Compliance Committee. We received multiple complaints regarding unapproved structures, excessive noise, and improper equipment visibility. My jaw clenched. Karen, she hadn't even waited a full day. The man handed me a stack of papers. These are official notices. You have 72 hours to comply. I flipped through the pages. Fines, demands, photos taken from the road. Every detail twisted to make me look like I was destroying the neighborhood. This is a farm, I said flatly. Your rules don't apply to agricultural operations. We operate under the expanded community jurisdiction, the other man replied. All properties within the boundary must comply. I never agreed to be part of the HOA. That doesn't matter, he said without hesitation. Your property falls within the boundary, therefore you are subject to the board's authority. The confidence in his voice made my blood boil. It was the same kind of blind arrogance Karen had. They believed power made them right. They believed paperwork was more important than history, more important than livelihood, more important than common sense. I suggest you start making changes immediately. One of them said, failure to comply may result in legal escalation. They didn't wait for me to respond. They simply got back in their car and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and a stack of threats in my hand. I stared down at the papers, anger simmering beneath the surface. Karen was tightening her grip, and she wasn't even hiding it. I tossed the papers onto the workbench in the barn and went back to the field. I needed to keep harvesting. The crops wouldn't wait for bureaucracy. Still, every time the tractor engine roared back to life, I wondered if Karen was somewhere nearby watching. By late afternoon, clouds gathered overhead, casting long shadows across the field. I saw another vehicle approaching down the driveway. For a moment I tensed, expecting Karen again, but this time it was my neighbor, David. He leaned out the window of his truck and waved me over. You're not going to like this, he said as soon as I got close. I already don't like today. He handed me a folded piece of paper. They're circulating this around the neighborhood. I unfolded it and scanned the contents. My name, my address, a list of accusations, noise pollution, hazardous equipment, environmental concerns, community disruption. At the bottom, a petition to force mandatory compliance or forced removal from the HOA district. How many signatures? I asked quietly. Almost everyone, David said with a frown. But don't take it personally. Karen's been telling people you're a danger to the community. She says you're ignoring safety rules. She even told some folks you almost hit her with your tractor. I stared at him. She walked into the field and stood in front of it. He nodded. I know, but not everyone else does. The realization hit me like a punch. Karen wasn't just attacking me with rules, she was rewriting reality. And people believed her. She's planning something, David warned. I heard her talking to the rest of the board. She wants to prove you're reckless, dangerous. She wants to bring in law enforcement if she can. I tightened my fists. For working my land? She doesn't see it as your land, he said. She sees it as hers now. I looked back at the rows of corn, the generations of work behind them. She'll have to pry it from my hands, David hesitated. Just be careful. Karen doesn't stop until she wins. He drove off, leaving me alone with the distant rumble of thunder. I stood there for a moment, the wind shifting through the stalks. Karen was coming for more than control. She wanted to break me, ruin me, erase me, but she didn't understand some. The morning of the hearing arrived with a heavy stillness, like the air itself was holding its breath. I stood outside the courthouse watching people file in. Some familiar faces avoided eye contact while others gave subtle nods of support. The tension in the community had become visible, lines drawn not by fences but by loyalty and fear. Karen arrived dressed sharply, chin high, confidence radiating off her like perfume. She walked with 2 board members at her side, though they looked more nervous than supportive. As she passed me, she didn't speak, but the cold, defiant glare she gave told me everything. She wasn't here to defend herself. She was here to win. We stepped inside. The courtroom wasn't crowded, but there were more observers than I expected. Neighbors, HOA members, even a few people from town who had heard the rumors. This wasn't just a dispute. It had become a spectacle. When the hearing began, the judge reviewed the injunction and the complaint. His expression remained unreadable, but his focus was sharp. He asked both sides to present their cases. Karen went first. Her lawyer was polished and deliberate, painting her as a dedicated community advocate who had simply been enforcing rules. They claimed I was uncooperative, hostile, and dismissive of the HOA's authority. They brought up the tractor incident, twisting it to imply I caused the collision. They called the trespass a scheduled inspection. They claimed every complaint was legitimate, every action justified. Karen sat straight-backed, nodding along, occasionally glancing at the audience to make sure they saw her as the victim. Her performance was almost convincing. Almost. Then it was our turn. Harris stood calm and methodical. He didn't rush. He started with the basic facts, my property, my rights, my long history in the community with 0 issues, until Karen became HOA president. Then he brought out the evidence.emails, where she singled me out. Letters escalating in aggression.false reports to police.unauthorized property assessments trespassing, incidents, witness statements, recordings of her threatening me, photos of damage, and burned grass near my field. The room shifted. The polished narrative Karen had built began to crack. When Harris played the audio of Karen on my property saying, "You have no idea who you're messing with," more than a few heads turned toward her. She stiffened in her seat, eyes narrowing, jaw tightening. We called witnesses next. Mark testified first, calm, detailed, credible. He explained how Karen manipulated the board and ignored votes she didn't like. He admitted he'd been afraid to speak up until now. David followed. He described the tractor incident in full, how Karen ignored warnings, hit the equipment, then blamed me. His tone carried quiet conviction. Several other neighbors spoke, some reluctantly, some passionately. They talked about fines for minor things, intimidation in meetings, sudden rule changes without notice. Each story wasn't as extreme as mine, but together they painted a picture of systematic bullying. Then Sheriff Collins took the stand. His presence changed the atmosphere instantly. He wasn't emotional. He wasn't biased. He was factual. He testified that complaints against me were exaggerated or baseless. He explained that Karen attempted to use law enforcement as a tool against me. He confirmed that she had been warned about her behavior. He finished by saying, "In my professional opinion, this was personal, not procedural." Silence followed. It was time for Karen to speak. She took the stand with forced composure, but this time her confidence faltered. Harris questioned her directly. Each question peeled away another layer. He showed her own words contradicting previous statements. He revealed how she bypassed board votes, how she scheduled assessments without approval, how she targeted me differently than other residents. Under pressure, her defensiveness turned into anger. She snapped at Harris. She glared at the judge. And then, she made the mistake we'd been waiting for. She said, "People like him think they can ignore the rules because they've been here longer." I had to make an example. The courtroom went still. The judge leaned forward. An example? Karen hesitated, realizing too late what she'd admitted. Harris didn't need to say a word. Her intent was now crystal clear. This wasn't about community standards. It was about power and control. By the time closing arguments ended, the outcome felt inevitable. The judge took a brief recess, then returned with his decision. He ruled in my favor. He stated that the HOA, under Karen's leadership, had engaged in harassment, abuse of authority, and selective enforcement. He upheld the injunction against Karen, ordered her removed from any decision-making role pending further investigation, and mandated an independent audit of the HOA. Then, he said something I'll never forget. Homeowners associations exist to support communities, not to terrorize them. Karen sat frozen, face pale, eyes burning with shock and fury. She looked like someone who had just watched her empire collapse. The board members beside her didn't offer comfort. They shifted away, distancing themselves. It was over, at least legally, but the story didn't end in the courtroom. As I walked out, neighbors approached me. Some apologized for staying silent. Others thanked me for standing up. Word spread through town that the HOA was being restructured, with new leadership and new rules. Fair rules. Transparent rules. Days later, a letter arrived from the county. There would be further investigation into financial irregularities and misuse of HOA funds. I had a guess who they'd find at the center of it. Karen disappeared from public view for a while. Her house was quiet, curtains closed. For someone who once controlled everything, the silence around her was almost jarring. One evening, weeks later, I saw her outside for the first time, standing at the end of her driveway, staring across the road. At me. There was no glare this time. No threat. Just a person stripped of the power she'd clung to. She turned and went inside without a word. Life slowly returned to normal. Harvest finished. Neighbors talked again. The board held open meetings, real ones. We disagreed sometimes, but we spoke respectfully. The community actually felt like a community again. Looking back, I realized something important. Karen thought fear kept people in line. She was wrong. It was courage that changed everything. Not loud courage. Not reckless courage. Just the quiet willingness to say enough and stand firm even when it wasn't easy. She tried to isolate me, but in the end, she exposed herself, because power built on intimidation doesn't last, and the moment people stop being afraid, it collapses. For the first time in a long time, I stood at the edge of my field, watching the sun set over the rows of cut corn, and felt peace. Karen nearly broke this community, but she also revealed its strength, and I knew, if anything like this ever happened again, we wouldn't face it alone.